I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Khulud Khair. She is a British Sudanese analyst and the managing partner of Insight Strategy Partners, a think tank based in Khartoum. Thanks a lot for joining us, Khulud. And I'm happy to welcome Dr. Gerrit Kurz. He's a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and is specialized on Eastern Africa, the Horn of Africa, and Sudan. And just very briefly, we will talk about the recent developments in Sudan, especially since the beginning of this new transitional period leading up to the Berlin Conference. And we will take a closer look at what actually was discussed and achieved at this conference. But first of all, since maybe not every one of you is so up to date with everything that's happening in Sudan, and it's actually quite a lot, I would like to ask Khulud to give us a quick recap of like the most important development milestones that we witnessed in Sudan during the last 1 to 2 years. So Khulud, the floor is yours.
The past few years have been quite eventful in Sudan, but the events of last year particularly can be traced to the 2013 September uprising, which signaled an awakening of a generation thought to be browbeaten by the autocratic Islamist military regime. From 2013, protests about a variety of interlinked issues became more frequent, and from 2016 particularly, the number of protesters swelled and coalesced around increasingly shared issues. On the surface, these latter protests seem to be about bread prices, as in December 2018, the IMF's advice to lift subsidies on wheat was followed by a formerly resistant Bashir regime that had started to find it increasingly more difficult to maintain their patronage networks, which had grown more and more burdensome with the loss of oil revenues from the secession of South Sudan in 2011. But by December 2018, many lingering issues contributed to the pressure cooker moment when in Al-Damazin, the capital of Blue Nile State, school children protested the price of sandwiches in their school cafeteria after the partial lifting of subsidies on wheat. Taken in isolation, this may not seem to be a significant trigger, but it had culminated from what was seen as several failures by the Bashir regime to uphold its portion of the largely flawed social contract, wherein enough groups in the center were able to have some strategic needs met, including observance of Islamic jurisprudence, in return for their acquiescence to a repressive regime. We see this in various ways elsewhere: heightened government surveillance in exchange for a feeling of safety and prosperity, as in much of the West, or government handouts in exchange for political and social rights, like in the Gulf. So on April the 6th, after months of protest, a sit-in began outside the headquarters of the armed forces, bringing together protesters from pro-democracy groups and also individuals without any political or party allegiance. On the 11th of April, Bashir fell and was ostensibly removed by the army to jubilation and some shock from the streets, because the vast majority of Sudan's population is under 30, and for them, they had no memory of a time when Omar al-Bashir and his cronies were not in power. One day later, on the 12th, the army institutes General Ibn Auf, who is in power for less than a day and is swiftly removed after sustained protest. From then onwards, a committee of army generals named the Transitional Military Council, TMC, was led by General Burhan and had opted to take over until a political settlement would be reached. This Transitional Military Council took credit for unseating Bashir, which I don't agree with. But by assuming that credit, the military had also promised to safeguard the transition to civilian rule, something which is rather against their interests. And this contradiction, alongside the protesters' lack of faith in the way that the army was instituting ever more army leaders, meant that the sit-in continued throughout April and May, coinciding with the month of Ramadan. The armed forces, within which were Islamists loyal to Bashir's regime, continued to cause consternation for pro-democracy protesters, and the tensions and lack of uncertainty resulted in what is unfortunately a go-to move for the Sudanese armed forces, an attack on civilians. And on June the 3rd, a massacre took place, thought to be orchestrated by a handful of cross-armed forces officials, though the legal investigation results are still not out. However, the case has already been tried in the court of public opinion, and the military, in all its guises, held accountable. 130 people were killed, hundreds injured, and reported cases of rape, number 16, but are likely to be higher. International actors had also held the military accountable as the TMC had assumed power already. And the massacre was live streamed, so denying the events became even more difficult for the authorities. Publicly, the TMC vacillated between casual indifference, saying, quote, what happened, happened, and performative regret, saying that they felt, quote, sorrow for the way things escalated, while simultaneously disingenuously blaming petty criminals for the attacks, and while at the same time video images showed men in uniforms bearing down on protesters. This gaslighting of the Sudanese public, so reminiscent of both the approach and the arrogance of the NCP, served to galvanize broader swathes of protesters, as well as those who had been on the fence about the possibilities that change could bring. For others, playing around with the designation of the end of Ramadan reminded them of the way the NCP had played with religion in order to maintain power. Civilian negotiations with the military derailed massively after the massacre, and resistance committees, who had been the heart of the mobilization against Bashir, and other pro-democracy groups decided that a rebalancing of the power dynamic after such an extreme show of force by the military required an equally strong show of force that was diametrically opposed. So in this case, a mass mobilization of peaceful marches. And public anger and gut-wrenching agony at the potential of losing progress after such a historic event, unseating an autocratic leader in a region that had not been able to successfully do the same, meant that millions of Sudanese came out in mass protests on the 30th of June later that month throughout the country. After the stalemate of the massacre, with no accountability for those responsible in sight, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the African Union, aware that an unstable Sudan would further destabilize the whole region, stepped in to mediate between civilian and military forces. And so on August the 11th, a power-sharing agreement was signed, ushering in a new hybrid government, both military and civilian, for 39 months, made up of a largely military sovereign council led by General Burhan and the civilian government of technocrats led by Dr. Hamdok, the current prime minister. This was seen largely as a success because it brought an end to a period of uncertainty. However, many, I think rightly, felt that after the 30th of June show of power of pro-democracy forces, that fewer concessions could have been made by the civilian side, represented by the Forces for Freedom and Change, a cohort of political parties, trade unions, and others. This fated compromise has reverberations today, 11 months on, where the balance of power between military and civilian groups is almost always in favor of the military. In all, the regime change was hard won, but transition to civilian rule remains elusive. And today, a third of the way into the transition period, we have tensions between civilian and military parts of the government, between the civilian government and the multi-factional Forces for Freedom and Change, and with civil society largely subsumed into the governance architecture. The transitional government is often labeled a civilian-military hybrid, but I feel that intimates a level of synergy, a harmonious power sharing between different parts that's not really borne out. I found it more helpful to view the current governance model as chimeric, after the chimera Greek mythological creature that has three distinct parts: a lion's head, a ghost body, and a snake's tail. Which part is the head is often dependent on the issue at hand, but more often than not, we're seeing the military elements much more in charge, so to speak. We also have to remember that there are not only 2 or 3 different parts of this government, but several dynamic pieces: the Forces for Freedom and Change, individual ministers who act mostly individually, the Sudan Armed Forces, the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, led by Hemeti, and the oligarchs, or the Jalaba, who have an inordinate amount of influence on today's politics. In many ways, the government can seem as disparate as the political parties that created it. Each ministry tends to work in silos, and interministerial coordination has been quite a challenge. The resistance committees, who provided the engine for change, are largely absent from political consideration. And the civilian government's connections to these revolutionary constituents is tenuous and not very well maintained. Though they remain the source of the civilian government's power, and alliances with the military or through the chaotic FFC will not give them the continued support that they seek. And the government has to remember not to take that for granted. To be sure, the civilian government is expected to perform a Herculean task of getting Sudan in shape for elections. And while much can be done, the balance between delivering fully and maintaining the balance of power with the military is a difficult one to maintain. especially with the persistence of the same issues that blight every transition, bearing in mind Sudan is in its third transition from military rule to democracy in 64 years. And these issues are petty infighting between political parties, obstruction from antagonistic political groups, and of course, the spectre of further military rule hanging like a sword of Damocles on the head of the civilian government. So the COVID pandemic has influenced the way that power is also perceived. And power is largely perception. So the pandemic was at first an opportunity to address the balance of power. And then it became a magnifying glass to the transitional government's already existing challenges. At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw the transitional government operating not as a group of individual technocrats, but as a cohesive government, pulling the levers of state power in a way that demonstrated ownership of that seat of power. What we had seen before, and to some extent continue to see, is a hesitancy of the civilian government to act and to make the promise of the revolution bear fruit. And this gave rise to the 30th of June 2020, this year's commemorative protest, which had been in response to the slow pace of reform of the civilian government. So this time, the government sent a delegation to speak to and listen to protesters, a complete departure from the way it responded to communal violence earlier this year in May in Eastern Sudan, where uniformed mediators were sent to deal with the issue. I think this may signal a growing confidence in civilian government's sense of itself as the legitimate authority in power. And no doubt this new confidence is connected in part to the boon the civilian government received to the 25th of June Friends of Sudan Partners Conference, where a reaffirmation of its role as a legitimate governing body by international counterparts helped it to rebalance the power dynamic between it and the military, whose allies at the conference pledged either very little or refused to even reiterate their previous financial commitments. And just yesterday, several ministers, including the ministers of Foreign Affairs, Health and Finance, left office after calls for faster reform, and new political accommodations from the peace deals are expected. The demands of some of these armed groups, such as the Sudan Liberation Army Mini-Manawi, have already been made public and seem rather ambitious. For those ministers who do remain, it is a vote of confidence from the Prime Minister in their work so far. This may also prove to be an opportunity for the Prime Minister to cultivate a greater internal cohesion within his government. What is less clear is how the longer-term issues will be dealt with without the requisite administrative policy mechanisms at the heart of government. Any new ministers will equally be hamstrung by the absence of a policy-making architecture, as well as the fact that the impact of all positive changes are limited only to higher public offices, leaving governmental offices at ministerial, state, and local level susceptible to sabotage from members of the ancien regime, Bashir's regime. But what these moves do show is that Hamdok is increasingly engaging, I think quite rightly, like a politician rather than a technocrat. And the timing of these ministerial dismissals after the Friends of Sudan Berlin conference and after some progress had been made with settlements with armed groups, and at a time when several protests and sit-in sites around the country are popping up, shows a more masterful response to goings-on around the country. The cabinet reshuffle in particular shows some measure of course correction from the civilian government's earlier inertia, and the government being more dynamic and less hesitant to try again, fail better, as Samuel Beckett would have it. And given Sudan's cyclical history from democracy to autocracy, from democracy to autocracy, and so forth, then the enduring presence and appeal of the military to both domestic and international actors, the civilian government cannot afford to be complacent. Thank you.
Thank you, Khulud. A very, very dense presentation of the recent events in Sudan. I would like to give the word to Dr. Gerrit Kurz. Khulud, you already mentioned the culmination of this process now, or expansion on a international level. And Gerrit, I would like to ask you, how did this Berlin conference, took shape? What is the scope of it? Is it the beginning of a new engagement from the European and especially German side? And what are all the sides we're going into, and what has been achieved in this first round of meetings here in Berlin?
Shortly after this coup took place in Khartoum, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates pledged $3 billion together, so 1.5 billion each, to the new power dispensation, because already back then Sudan was in a deep economic crisis. But of course, that strengthened fears also internationally that these powers, which would mean, and there's a close support, would mean that the military and the security forces, the rapid support forces and the armed forces, they would be in charge, and it would be like other changes that we've seen so far. And so for internationals that wanted, and very much in line with what the streets in Khartoum and elsewhere wanted, a more democratic civilian regime, things needed to happen. So international coordination took place already before April. The first informal meeting that Germany or German Foreign Office called on with a core group of states was already in March. And it was from this core group that had originally developed as monitoring contact group for mediation support that Germany had provided to a full peace process, that eventually the so-called Friends of Sudan evolved. So there were further meetings. There was a meeting in DC hosted by the State Department. And then there was the first diplomatic meeting that included Arab and African states in June 2019, just shortly after the horrible massacre of the 3rd of June. In any case, the transitional government was formed, and now that the internationals had somewhat legitimate or more legitimate counterparts in the form of the transitional government led by Prime Minister Hamdok, so led by a civilian, former UN official, which they felt they could do business. And since then, they have been, the government of Sudan has been involved in the regular Friends of Sudan meetings. And it was in this context of the informal grouping of the Friends of Sudan that the idea of initially a donor conference was hatched, because I mean, very shortly after the transitional government came into power, they immediately said, well, first of all, we need a lot of money from the international partners. Specifically, Hamdok and Finance Minister Al-Badawi said we need $10 billion to stabilize the economy, and just basically to keep it stable, to keep it from falling down. They didn't get it, and especially the exchange rate of the pound tumbled significantly in the months following the takeover of power in September. In any case, a host was sought, and it took a few more weeks until then Germany, who had already had this profile of having helped to set up the Friends of Sudan, offered to co-host the partnership conference. And there was also this idea that it would be a partnership conference, not just a donor conference. So there would be a double objective. Yes, there would be pledging towards specifically a multi-donor trust fund set up by the World Bank to support the so-called Sudan Family Support Program, which I can explain a bit more if you want, but basically to mitigate the economic adjustments, including the planned removal of the fuel subsidy and floating of the exchange rate. So that was the main idea, but also to send a strong political signal. So there was a communique that all almost 50 participating countries and international organizations signed afterwards. So there will be a process afterwards. So perhaps to sum up, was this a success? I think because you alluded to the Libya conference, it was quite different. So I think in terms of ambition in foreign policy, one can compare it perhaps in some sense, because for Germany, that is perhaps this was part of the reason why it hosted it. And so there was no negotiations at the conference anymore, right? It was relatively well done, I think, for such an event. I mean, you had BBC host, Badawi also called, and you had statements then from different countries and organizations. And I think the 1.8 billion in all funding, so not just for the family support program, but also in terms of development funding and humanitarian aid, old pledges and new pledges, is already a significant amount. A high number of delegations was certainly a success. And one thing that was also very important is the re-engagement of the international financial institutions. So just when the conference started, the IMF could announce that it would start a staff monitoring program, which will help as a step towards debt relief. Sudan is, of course, very heavily indebted and needs a debt relief process, but for that to happen, needs such a program, so basically supervised reforms. And there will be a follow-up process, and I think that's helpful. I mean, as Hulud already alluded to, I mean, we may see this more now in the coming weeks and months ahead, but it was striking that the Arab countries, the Gulf countries that had pledged so much before, were now pledging much less, and where we're not in the forefront anymore. So some people said, well, now you could see who Sudan's real friends were. That's the organizer speaking. But in any case, certainly there's a potential that brings a new dynamic. Yes.
Thank you, Gerrit Kurz, for this very interesting insight into how these conferences work in these times of pandemic, and how on the one hand they became more transparent, but also maybe something is missing from the usual format. Anyway, I think the re-engagement is something very, very notable. And I want to ask Hulud, how did the Sudanese perceive this? Were they more happy that they were heard, that the protest movement had not only led to a change in government, but even to a re-engagement of the international community? Or was there a feeling of being properly represented at this conference? So can you tell us a bit how the discourse in Sudan went, and how they viewed this? Did they view the live streams? Was this like a big topic? Can you give us an insight into the discussion among Sudanese civil society?
I think I have to be careful not to speak on behalf of Sudanese civil society, but I can certainly share my observations, which were mostly that people, from the outset, I think, of Hamdok and his government taking over, people felt a sense that Sudan was being brought back into the international fold after so many years, in the cold. And I think people felt encouraged by that, but that has to be supported by, tangible, structural support, financial support, etc. And I think what we're seeing at this particular part of the conference, as opposed to the others, was that the level of transparency by having it online and with greater access meant that people felt that they were being included on some level. And of course, this isn't everybody. But there were certain quarters that felt for once that they were at least able to attend. And that, you have to remember, coming out of 30 years of autocratic rule, that level of transparency was unheard of, or it would be unthinkable. So I think that's on the kind of political discourse side was a very strong part of the way that this partnership conference was held. What I would say is that, in terms of the results, almost $2 billion pledged, actually, as Garrett mentioned, is a fifth of what the government had originally said that they needed last year. And since then, the economic situation has certainly deteriorated. So it's the economic or the financial capital of this conference is nowhere near as important as the diplomatic capital that the civilian side was able to accrue through this process. And having it so clearly and so transparently broadcasted, it enabled the civilian government to say or to increase its confidence in itself vis-a-vis the military. And the military has always had more access, if you will, to more assured funding from the Gulf. And so what we saw at the conference was that Gulf countries were less likely, and by this I mean Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, even though they're not at all politically aligned, the three of them. None of them were as keen to support a civilian government as other countries. So I think we saw that very specific split between Gulf donors and Western and other donors, including support from the African Union, from Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, and from South Africa. So we had two almost distinct camps in terms of what kind of support those countries wanted to give. And, when Egypt was undergoing its transition after the fall of Mubarak, it got, I think, $15 billion or something of the like from Saudi and the UAE in kind of an anticipation that the military would take over there. And I think it shows the Gulf's preference for a military rule in Sudan, both because they're easier to deal with than a chaotic civilian government that may or may not change after every 4 or 5 years, according to democratic tradition. But also because Sudan is, I think, the regional cautionary tale for a lot of these autocratic governments in the region. They don't want what's happening in Sudan to happen in their countries. And what's happening in Sudan is by no means a perfect process, but there is at least some level of progress. As flawed and complicated and difficult as it is, there is some forward mobility. And I think that is a big threat for Gulf countries and other countries undergoing the Arab Spring and other such social movements. What I would say particularly about Germany's role, though, is that Germany is one of the few countries that's actually put its money where its mouth is. Germany had, let go of its unilateral sanctions against Sudan. The German president, Steinmeier, came to Sudan earlier this year. Hamdok visited Angela Merkel in Berlin. We're seeing Germany actually contribute in a much more meaningful way. And I'm hoping that other countries take this as an example of how potentially they could interact with Sudan, because I think the public will become very tired very quickly about countries, particularly other Western countries, posturing about how much they support this transition, how much they support political and civilian rule without actually putting any effort behind it. Talk is cheap, as they say.
Thank you very much, Khulud. Gerrit, Khulud just spoke about the often difficult relationship in diplomacy during the last years with the Gulf countries, but also spoke about Germany's re-engaged role. We often deplore the absence of a European response, and now Germany steps up. What do you think? How are the other major European stakeholders viewing that, especially France and Great Britain, keeping in mind that in Libya we already see very differing approaches, also approaches as we see with France that had staked its bet on Khalifa Haftar and maybe forced to reconsider that. Will they take a good look at what Germany is doing and then align with that, or are they doing like their own calculations? What do you think? Will there be a unified European response, and how would it look like, and how would it also engage with regional partners, especially from the Gulf, in terms of Sudan policy?
Yes, luckily, Sudan is not Libya, also in terms of Europe's engagement with it, and also its interests and policies. So the EU member states have been largely aligned, I think. I mean, actually, there are not that many that have broad interests. Of course, France and now the UK is not a EU member, but European country are different. But Sudan, France doesn't have the same economic interests that it had in Sudan as it has in Libya. So there's a clear difference. I think from Sudan's point of view, one of the most important aspects of France is actually the fact that it hosts Abdel Wahid al-Nur, a rebel leader, and the one rebel leader that has always resisted participating in peace talks, including now, but who still controls, or whose fighters are still active in central Darfur and Jebel Mara, even though apparently he's also losing influence there. But because he's based in Paris, France had always had a certain role there, and I think behind the scenes is also actively trying to engage and trying to get him to relent in a way as difficult as that seems. And I think it's for the UK. They are, of course, part of the more established Troika format of the US, UK, and Norway that has coordinated policy on Sudan and South Sudan for now almost 2 decades, since the negotiations that ended in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005. They are still part of that, and the Troika still exists. But as you know, the UK is very much engulfed by its own domestic issues or European issues, Brexit in particular. And that has meant, frankly, that although they do have a special envoy, and Germany doesn't, on Sudan and South Sudan, they have been a bit hamstrung there. So when it comes to high-level political support, so they were also part of the Friends of Sudan, of the core group as well. There's close coordination taking place. So I think that is largely developing quite unified as in this case. And the European Union as an institution is also one of the largest donors in Sudan, the second largest donors after the US. In fact, I mean, traditional donors, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, with their billions, they outnumber everyone. So I think that's more helpful when it comes to engaging with regional partners. I think that is still something that Germany in particular, but perhaps also others in this European group, core group in the Friends of Sudan, as having still difficulties with. Certainly the Brits and the French and also the Americans, they are more used to negotiating, dealing with Arab powers, but often Germany could hide behind that, because in Sudan certainly didn't have that large of a profile. But in the end, the running up to the partnership conference and during the months after the transition, the transitional government came into power, there was a lot of hand-wringing because they always knew that it was so difficult that of course, Sudan needed this big chunk of money just to stabilize the economy and then also start productivity and development. But they also knew that there was little chance that it would come from the West, or that large chunks would come from the West. That was always the narrative. And that they were actually hoping, not just Germans, but I think many others as well, that the Arab powers would take on the bill, as they had started to when there was just a military government in Sudan. But this turned out to be quite different now. So I think, just to repeat, this is actually an interesting development, which in this sense has not been foreseen by the foreign ministries either.
My next question would be to Khulud. You said a lot has been achieved, and so you have an optimistic view. Still, there's the legacy of this June 3rd massacre. We just published a piece on our page on zenit.me where some of the survivors and eyewitnesses of this horrible massacre shared their feelings about the whole political process, but especially about getting justice for what had happened there. So what is your view? How can this desire to achieve justice and to bring those responsible, to hold them accountable, can that be squared to the transitional process, and especially the crucial role that military figures play, especially this very divisive figure, mostly known under his pseudonym Hemeti? Maybe you can tell a bit more about this person, his role, and what the expectations of the survivors, eyewitnesses of the massacres are, and how this quest for justice can be squared with the need to succeed in this transition.
It's a very complicated question. I think the issue of accountability is central to any kind of meaningful transition. And the civilian government knows this, the military, all forms of military know this, civil society knows this. And so it's kind of an inescapable truth, which makes it difficult to reconcile the political pressure to do so from the ground and the complications that arise from indicting potentially very powerful figures that remain, in power. And justice for June the 3rd was all the mechanical aspects of seeking justice for June the 3rd seemed to be in play. So you have a very high-ranking legal officer, Nabil Adib, in charge of an investigation committee that had very kind of a broad investigation committee, and they looked at different types of evidence. It was very encouraging at the beginning. However, the delay in the results of that investigation coming out show us, I think, just how difficult reconciling or reckoning with the results of that investigation will be. This brings us to. I mean, you asked what are the chances of its success. I think it's not something that can be put off indefinitely, for sure. But I think this kind of ostrich policy of putting one's head in the sand and expecting it to clear, the storm to clear, is not going to serve either side. What I'm afraid of is that there will be, a straw man, if you will, kind of fingered, and he will be said to have orchestrated or instigated the massacre, whereas that may or may not be true. And just to have a kind of kangaroo trial that will appease people and will give them a sense of justice, even if actual justice isn't taking place. And that I think would be a compromise that the government, particularly the military in the government, would be more keen to do than any kind of meaningful, what we would consider meaningful accountability. And there are a lot of rumors and innuendos in the public discourse about who exactly is to blame. And I think the government, the military in particular, would be, I think it's served by all these rumors and innuendos because it's able to kind of play different sides against each other. It's able to see, the pulse of the discussion and make its decision. I think it's going to keep delaying this as much as possible so that they're able to make a decision at a time that suits them, which of course isn't what genuine accountability is like at all. But this brings us to this kind of clever politicking, if you will, brings us to, the man in question, Hemeti, who is arguably the most powerful man in the country, because though he is not king, he is the deputy head of the sovereign council. He's a kingmaker. So what we've seen recently is that he has been, well, not recently, pretty much since June of last year, since the Transitional Military Council was formed, since Bashir fell, we have seen people court him, different political actors. Some very well-established political actors court Hemeti because they understand that his wealth, his personal army, and his kind of more longer-term planning, which is very much in contrast to most Sudanese government planning, which is very short-term. But those three things make him a very formidable ally. I'm not sure that anybody really wants to see Hemeti take, the top job, if you will, and I'm not sure that he actually wants to either. His political ambitions may or may not peak at where they are now. What we do know about him, though, is that 20 years ago, he was a camel herder in Darfur, and now he's the most powerful man in the country. He's also much younger than almost every other senior political actor right now. So he has, the benefit of time. He's able to make these longer-term 10, 20-year plans, or whereas other political actors, can't. For example, Sadiq al-Mahdi is in his 90s. He still thinks that he can be Prime Minister of Sudan and has been pushing for early elections, but of course he cannot make the same level of long-term plans that Hemeti can. So I think Hemeti kind of likes the position that he's in, because it means that he can have his pick of which direction to go in. That makes him something of a danger, if you will, to the political transition, because as an unknown sort of entity, we don't know what his plans are, but we do know that he's well-resourced to carry them out. It means that the balance of power, if you will, between the streets, any civilian groups, including the civilian government, are going to be kind of outmatched by him. So that's the fear. What we also saw was last year, after Hemeti being labeled, the leader of the Janjaweed, after people said, particularly in the Western media, they made this kind of bogeyman out of him, that he was this kind of, a genocidaire who had committed atrocities. And then all of a sudden we saw some ambassadors from the West meet with him, and suddenly he was reasonably rehabilitated. So we have to be careful. It's not just domestic political actors that are seeking pathways through or with Hemeti, but he is, very well placed to carry out many people's interests and many people's plans. So I don't have a definite answer on him. I just know that he's one to watch. It continues to be one to watch, continues to be relevant.
Okay, in the meantime, thank you very much, Khulud. In the meantime, some people followed my call and entered questions. The first one is Sabuh Aziz. I will unmute you now so you can address the question. Is the question to both of our speakers? Yeah. Kannst du ihn unmuten?
My question really is, at the moment, Germany is the presiding over the EU Council and also the United Nations Security Council. And last week, the Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, mentioned that the current situation in Libya and in Syria is being paralyzed by the United Nations Security Council. And I was just wondering whether the fact that Germany doesn't have a veto or a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council is part of this paralysis, and how can Sudan and African Union help Germany attain a fair position at the United Nations Security Council in order for, move forward all these issues and these challenges that's facing places like Libya, Syria, or now Sudan?
being a permanent member wouldn't resolve the problems in the Security Council and the differences between the big power, major power camps, the differences between the US and China, for example, would still be there. And they were to blame for months of delay until the Council finally adopted a resolution on the security implications of COVID-19 on the 1st of July only. So I think also the comparison with Libya and Syria shows again why perhaps it was really quite helpful that it was not in the Security Council that the main international debates about the transition process in Sudan took place and are taking place, but in the more flexible and more informal Friends of Sudan. Because there you do not have, they don't have any decision-making power, of course, so that's perhaps also a drawback, but then you also do not have the same polarization and paralysis, as you rightly quoted our foreign minister, as in the Security Council. Where Germany, of course, did play an important role in the Security Council is on the Darfur Sudan file. So Germany is co-pen holder with the UK of, so it's called Darfur Sudan, so because there's also RBA, and which is, I think the Americans are pen holder. But on Darfur, Germany engaged and negotiated the reconfiguration of UNAMID in Darfur, and perhaps even more importantly, they successfully negotiated a resolution that was adopted last month to establish UNITAM's, United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, so a new special political mission to support the transition process and the peace process. In particular, that will be operational at the latest by the 1st of January next year. So, and that was passed unanimously. So, of course, they had to make important concessions there, which I could go into if you would want to know more. But important was that at least this happened. So, I don't think that you need necessarily a reform for that. It's already good if you can work within the constraints already, and that is already something.
Gerrit, you just mentioned RBA. It so happens that someone in the chat also mentioned RBA, and this is none other than our dear friend and colleague Roman Deckert, a specialist in Sudan and South Sudan. So I would like to give him the word. You have a question concerning Germany's role in another field and also concerning South Sudan. So please go ahead, Roman.
Yeah, thanks a lot, especially for organizing this. And it's great. I haven't been following things so closely as of recently, but of course you never quite get away from Sudan once you drank the water from the Nile, of course. But there's just one thing that I noticed also when President Steinmeier visited Sudan, and it's really this, Sudanese, if you can generalize, really have, they love Germany. It's like the total opposite, which is strange, of xenophobia. If you say you're from Germany, and you have to say like, well, it's not all perfect. And so I feel that I always have to preach this thing that, especially perhaps also in these times of, Black Lives Matter and so forth, that there is a decolonization of mindsets and so forth, that really there is a huge legacy that Germany has left. And the conflicts in Sudan, across Sudan, South Sudan, they're very complex. You have to look at different levels, but it always gets back to one point, and that is the militarization of the public arena of politics that has historically taken place, and Germany, especially West Germany, played a huge role in this. in its proxy wars with East Germany, basically. So I just want to remind people that it's not just Germany is being also nice to Sudan, and it's all very, Germany, the Prince of Peace, and so forth. It's not quite like that. I mean, the Sudanese security was basically set up by the German intelligence for a long time. Anyway, so that's just along this comment to briefly to make. I have, so I would be thankful if Garrett could comment on this, because I know he has read, he's one of the few people who read what I wrote about that. So it'd be great to get a confirmation from that. But yeah, I have two specific questions then. The first one to Khulud, thanks a lot. I mean, it's been marvelous to listen to you both, actually, to get this wrap up. And Rod, again, thanks a lot for organizing this. So because I've been working in media development for a long time, and of course the state of the press freedom and so forth is always a very important indicator for how things go. And I would just love to hear, how you feel the media landscape has developed, and especially, of course, I mean, some of us know, of course, Ustaz Faisal Mohammed Saleh. And I'd love to hear how he has been, balancing his tasks. And the last question, basically, to both of you is that for so many years, really, it was all about South Sudan, also Darfur, of course, much less, unfortunately, Eastern Sudan or Nuba. But I mean, it seems just to have completely vanished, if I'm right. So how are actually South Sudan relations in particular, and developments in especially disputed areas like Abyei? So those are basically the two questions I have.
On the militarization, I fully agree, and I mean, of course, I go back to your great archival work there, and I think this is indeed important. Perhaps one thing that I would add much more recently, I guess, is the migration cooperation, which also always comes up, not just in terms of Germany, but also in terms of the EU's cooperation with the Bashir regime. I think there are also a lot of false allegations, perhaps, what exactly happened. But if you just say that the EU and certain EU member states, such as Germany, cooperated with the Bashir regime in the Khartoum process with the explicit purpose to combat people smuggling and irregular migration. Even if it's just a dialogue, I think that already tells you enough. On the other question of Sudan and South Sudan relations, I mean, now this is interesting because the peace process for Sudan, well, and I should phrase it differently, the two peace processes in South Sudan and in Sudan were intricately linked, and still are. The negotiations for peace, for comprehensive peace agreement with Darfur armed groups and the SPLM North, they take place mainly in Juba, right, and are mediated by South Sudan. In turn, just this February, it was only that the transitional government of national unity was again formed in Juba, so for Sudan, with the very strong help of Hemeti, so with Sudan. So they remain tight, and I guess that their relations are better now, in the sense that back during the main part of the civil war in South Sudan, supporting the armed opposition in South Sudan, as you probably know. So based on that, it's better now. In Abyei, I mean, the situation is still unresolved. I think a few months ago there was quite a violent incident where also the UN peace operation UNISFA didn't work. So yeah, this I think will be with us for a long time. So
So I'll pick up Roman's question about the Ministry of Information and about press freedoms. You know, as you know, Sudan has had also a very strong media presence. Newspapers, you know, TV, radio stations, etc. And they were under attack during the Bashir, particularly towards the end. You know, we'd hear every other week that a newspaper has been shut down, or that the day's print had been seized, etc. And I think what we're seeing now is that a kind of a re-engagement with media channels. And it's no longer, I think, the traditional media channels of print and radio. There's a lot going on more organically, if you will, maybe without an institution behind you, that could also fall under the umbrella of media. And it's usually towards social media, production of, you know, information, videos, etc. And I think that reflects also the age range, the dominant age range in Sudan, which is under 30. So what I'm afraid of, and this is not just about, you know, Faisal Mohammed Saleh, the Minister of Information, but actually the people who led the revolution and that are leading the social and political change on the ground are not present in the same quarters as those who make the decision currently. The mean age of the civilian government is probably 50, 60, and the 60% of Sudan's population is under 30. So there's a massive generational gap there. And I think, you know, while we're seeing a resurgence of print media and particularly through SUNA, the television media, the Sudan News Agency, they will only appeal so much, I think, to the younger generation. And I think older generations will feel that they're kind of getting back that strong media that they had. And I think that's great. But that's a very limited success. You're not engaging with the majority of, you know, the people who are very politically engaged. And that, of course, causes issues of relevance. But again, this is not an indictment of Faisal Mohammed Saleh himself. I think his position, if you will, is a symptomatic of the lack of attention paid to the demographic aspects of power and governance structures at the moment.
We have a kind of a follow-up question that goes in a similar vein in terms of what kind of support beyond is actually needed. So I would give the word to Ms. Christine Weicht. And I think this is for Khulud, this question as well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me the question. Yes, my question is specifically picking up on Khulud's comment regarding structural policy reform processes and the ability to deliver on reforms for the transitional government in order to prove and legitimize this transitional government. So we have heard a lot on the higher level. I wanted to ask more specifically, what is really needed for Western donors to support Sudan in those ongoing policy and justice reform processes? If we're saying talk is cheap, then what is really what would really concretely help these efforts to support the government in their big job that they have at hand?
Thank you for your question. I think that we're seeing the government respond the best. If we're looking at support to the government, we're seeing it respond the best when it is given not necessarily financial support, but the kind of political and diplomatic support that will allow it to broaden or kind of to enable itself to make the difficult political decisions that it currently feels unable to. And that goes back to the issue of the balance of power between the civilian and the military. And, you know, the civilian government, one of its, I suppose, biggest shortcomings, that it is made up of technocrats. It is not made up of politicians. And because it's not made up of politicians, being in government is a very steep learning curve for every minister, for most high-level advisors, etc. And so potentially, and I know this would require a lot of amendment or change to the current way that donors interact with Sudan, which is generally either through aid or through aid-adjacent pathways. But it would require a different way of dealing or engaging with the government of Sudan. It would require, I think, a sustained commitment to political support should the government need it. I think, before and during the Bashir era, we've heard lots of talk of, countries being critical friends, I think is what they called it. But that didn't happen, of course. I think something, a kind of a more balanced, more equal relationship needs to be cultivated, and that needs to be cultivated by both sides. I think this will require a kind of paradigmatic shift in many of the donors, many of Western countries who I think have always dealt with Sudan as a country where they implement rather than a country that will be an equal partner and that there's like a give and take. With Gulf countries, it's a whole other ball game. But again, those dynamics persist where Sudan is a kind of a landscape rather than a place with people and its own kind of worthwhile, value-driven actions, plans, consequences. So I think a lot of work needs to be done at headquarters, wherever that is, in Brussels, in Berlin, in New York, before it even comes to the Sudanese shores. And I think that reconfiguring that relationship would be the biggest step. I don't have any kind of practical steps about how to go about that, because it would be different for every country. Right now, we have, as Garrett said, the US is still one of Sudan's biggest donors, but it's also a country that has put Sudan on the state-sponsored terror list. And so what you have right now is a very confusing foreign policy from the United States. It's using both carrot, the promise of some funding through the Friends of Sudan mechanism, and stick, the continued presence of Sudan in this state-sponsored terror list, even during this pandemic, which has meant that Sudan has not been able to access COVID-specific funding. And that's just a very kind of complicated and needlessly confusing foreign policy to have. I think, Western governments in particular need to understand, first of all, read the context very well and understand what they can do with their own political processes back home, but also how they could configure that power dynamic between Sudan and their countries that will enable the civilian government to actually make use of that engagement rather than the, Bashir era relationship, which was very much unbalanced.
We saw Turkey pop up basically all over the region where we didn't really expected them a few years back. And we have been observing the same development in the Horn of Africa region, Indian Ocean region, especially Somalia and Djibouti, also being a kind of a place of a turf war between Turkey and some Gulf states. So, and how far is Turkey already involved in the Sudanese arena, and what kind of interests do they pursue there? And
the role of Turkey is interesting because Turkey has, for the past 10 years or so, seemed to have wanted to bring about the Ottoman Empire 2.0. And what that has meant practically is that it is one of very few non-African, for example, national airline carriers that will fly into Somalia, will have regular services into Sudan. So it was a case of saturation, I think, for the Turks at a time when their economy could support it. And I don't think that Turkey's much more in that position anymore. So I think they have to be more tactical now about how they operate in the Horn of Africa region. What I would say is that it's undoubtedly a big blow to Erdogan and the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey that they have lost Bashir, because even though maybe they didn't get as much from him as they could have, because Bashir was actually reasonably adept at playing different international actors against each other. But he was still kind of, they could at least guarantee an audience with the ruling party, with the ruling officials. That is no longer guaranteed. And so for Turkey, one of the most important things is the Red Sea Port Sudan development in Sawakin. And right now it's doubtful as to whether they're able to still play for that contract. And this comes back to my earlier point, which is that Sudan's foreign policy is very poorly defined or poorly conceived, if it exists at all. And I think that's a major priority for Sudan right now. In the cabinet reshuffle that I mentioned earlier, one of the ministers to have been replaced is the foreign minister. And the person who has taken over from her is meant to be, I think, in charge of quite a few portfolios, but one of them will be to decide what happens in the Red Sea, whether Turkey or the UAE or others will have rights to develop that port, which will be a huge source of income both for the government of Sudan and for that country. I think ideologically, the Muslim Brotherhood are not having a good time. Turkey is not the big economic player it used to be. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt have been decimated, and Qatar is sidelined in the Gulf. But what I would say is that we shouldn't count them out. I think they still have a lot of cards to play. We're seeing, Erdogan making plays in Libya, and so I think they're down but not out. And I would hesitate to say that that just because they've lost, that kind of more concerted influence in Sudan, that they won't be making further plays in the future. And part of it also goes to the fact that Sudan is currently in a very moribund economic situation, which means that it can ill afford to turn away investment opportunities, etc., especially from non-traditional funders, donors, investors like Turkey, China, etc., because they come with fewer conditions. And even though, the government has changed and we are now supposedly in this great new dawn of democratic rule, or at least heading in that way, Sudan's choices are still limited. State-sponsored terror designation limits Sudan's financial opportunities. So I don't think the Sudanese government can afford to keep Turkey out long term.
I have a question that I'm personally very interested in, and this is also regional politics. It goes a bit along the lines of the last question, like regional foreign policy, and this is the Nile and the water question. We see this conflict developing for the last years in different iteration. Actually, it didn't really matter who was in power at that time, but it kept accelerating, especially between Egypt and Ethiopia. And if we look at the map, obviously Sudan is somewhat in the middle. So my question would be, what role does Sudan play here? Is that maybe also an opportunity to actually do something on a very specific and essential topic in terms of regional cooperation? And has Sudan more of a middle ground between these two powers to the north and the southeast, and how important in general for infrastructure development is that whole night question in the both of your opinion. And who wants to start? Maybe Khulud?
Sure. I mean, the timing of many of the recent developments, I think, have been, let's say, interesting for Sudan. COVID was its own particular is continuing to be its own particular challenge. Everything that's going on with the Nile Dam is own challenge, and basically it comes down to the government, I think, being caught unawares because it's already dealing with so many domestic issues that often, I think, hadn't had the time to put forth a proper response until push came to shove. And right now, the tensions are quite high around the Renaissance Dam, and Sudan has to make a decision. I think, the previous governments kind of lack of a very set foreign policy was actually something that helped it to be able to negotiate different interests in the region. I think this government can't afford to do that. But what it can afford to do is to say, actually, we have a lot of domestic support, so we can go with our own interests rather than try and play off the different interests of other countries. Unequivocally, Sudan's economic interests lie with Ethiopia, with the dam being filled, because it guarantees electricity for Sudan for a decade or more. And currently what we have, actually, there's a power cut right now, and we have had sustained power cuts for the past few weeks. And more than just, I think, the uncomfortable aspect of having a power cut, it stifles productivity. It's if you want to run a country, in the 21st century, unfortunately, you have a great dependence on electricity. So if Sudan were to look at its own interests rather than the historical interests of other countries, I think it would side quite clearly with Ethiopia. Not to say that there wouldn't be any kind of unforced issues with the dam being filled, but I think on balance, Sudan's interests lie with the dam being filled in Ethiopia. Unfortunately, Sudan's relationship with Egypt, which is more historical and not always, a positive one. I think there are a lot of, quarters within the Sudanese political space that still feel that siding with Egypt is something that is a position that Sudan should take, almost regardless of whatever the topic is. And I would, of course, hesitate to have that be the policy position of a country that has fought to shed many of the political choices that no longer suit it. So I think we'll wait and see. My hope is that Sudan, which is working actually quite hard right now in trying to mitigate any issues that the Grand Renaissance Dam will have, not just on Sudan, but also in Egypt. I think Sudan needs to stop seeing itself as a mediator between Ethiopia and Egypt and as a party to the negotiation, because it also has much to lose and much to gain, not just financially or economically, but also politically, if it doesn't make a position and then take that position firmly to show itself on the international stage, show others on the international stage that it's ready to play a part of a fully fledged legitimate government.
Last question. I want to combine that with the short-term question and the long-term outlook. So on the short term, of course, everyone is looking for the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has. So very shortly, how do you think how it specifically affects dynamics in Sudan? And as closing remarks, maybe if you would be so bold to give us like your best case prediction, your worst case, and your realistic case prediction on Sudan, and what to expect, and why maybe also we are well advised to follow developments in Sudan further beyond this call.
Long-term predictions are very difficult. I think, COVID has changed, as I said earlier, it had the potential to change the balance of power because it allowed the government to kind of take on the mantle of legitimate leadership and go through the motions of doing, what governments do, responding to crises, etc. What it has ended up doing is actually drawing attention to the pre-existing issues. And this isn't, of course, only the case for Sudan. In many countries, COVID has been a very kind of severe mirror to the pre-existing issues within the country. But what I would say about the COVID pandemic is that both the pandemic and the transition are both portals, if you will, to borrow from Arundhati Roy. And you have, two kind of concurrent portals that Sudan is going through at the moment. How much Sudan will shed going through this portal and into the post-COVID world, the post-transition world, remains to be seen. But I think it has some choices to be made. And I think Sudan the civilian government, I should say, is increasingly finding itself in a stronger position to be able to do that. not just because every day it lasts, it's proving something against, the historical pattern that Sudan has against, lots of political opposition, etc. I think the longer it stays, the more it itself is getting a better sense of itself. And with the right kind of support, not only financial, but political, diplomatic, etc., it will be able to hopefully marshal those things to create something inclusive, etc., for the country. So I'm more of an optimistic, I think, outlook, but within some limits, because there are very acute issues that Sudan currently faces, and if it doesn't grapple with them fast, it will be unable to make use of the opportunities that it has. And I think that ultimately means that Sudan needs to take stock of its potential and plan for it. The key word here is to plan for its potential sufficiently. Otherwise, it will always be beholden either to petty rivalries within the country or to external interests. And, as poverty rates look to rise, also a consequence of COVID pandemic, it's important to remember that Sudan is, in fact, not poor. It's just been consistently poorly managed for, some might say, more than 30 years. Sudan currently has a demographic dividend, which means it has a very young population that if it's able to marshal into, jobs that are valuable, that add value to the economy, it will be able to make a lot of economic prosperity out of. Much of its population is under 30, which means that you are able to, plan sufficiently. And it's resource rich and has great potential for further industrialization. It has a vibrant civil society, but it also has lots of different challenges. It has an aging politicians that refuse to give up power. It has a military hangover that it just can't shake. It has an oligarchic and rapacious private sector and geostrategic and political interests from the region that can make it a prize to be captured rather than a partner to be supported. So I'm not sure about the prospect of democracy. I remain, as I said, hopeful, but I think getting a better sense of itself domestically will help Sudan work better for its people, but also with partners in the region.
Yes, I think I largely agree with that assessment. I think the best case scenario clearly is a successful completion of the transition process with democratic elections in 2022. And the then establishment of a fully civilian government that truly represents the people of Sudan and the way towards greater inclusivity in Sudan, way beyond the center. So I think that's a truly great prize, but it is also very ambitious. So, and at least as likely is the worst case scenario of either a military takeover or collapse of the institutions of the transition process. And as Wuluj mentioned earlier, the justice and accountability file could be one of the triggers, but there could also be others. We just need to look. Process is different, of course, but if you look at neighboring Ethiopia in the past few days, where there's been an escalation of violence because one singer was killed, we do not even know by whom. You can see that, that again, it's a bit different in Sudan, but it's easy that things can get out of hand. There was an assassination attempt of Hamdok earlier this year, where he wasn't hurt, but it shows that there are still, I think, substantial forces out there from the former regime and from the Islamists that could derail the process with serious security incidents. But But as I think Prime Minister Hamdok, is always the first to point out, the process is not rosy and it is messy and non-linear. And I think it's really good that he takes on that narrative, because we shouldn't expect actually a linear path towards democracy and sustainable peace. Of course, that would be great, but it's much more likely that there will be setbacks. So it's important to foster resilience. And when I look at the incredible courage and long-term preparations also that went into the protests last year, that they were again just a few days ago, I see a lot of resilience in civil society in Sudan. I think that makes it hopeful.
Thank you very much. What I definitely take away from that is we have to pay attention what's going on in Sudan, especially with the 10 years anniversary of the Arab Spring coming up. You will probably see a lot of pieces saying more or less what went wrong. And so I think a lot of people just don't pay attention to what is actually going right or going on, and how to look into the future, and not only back in the 10 years and bemoan what hasn't been achieved. Also, stay tuned